got down to 80 feet, which is a lot for a first dive, way too much actually. And I was trying to figure out how to even out my weights, and all this was just all so new to me still. And I was just like, something isn't right. Now, remember, you're facing down at this point, right? And I was like, oh, I've got to figure this out. I stopped looking at my depth meter, and I was trying to mess with my weights. And all of a sudden, I felt this funny sensation on the back.
Welcome to Launch It, the Podcast Maestro, your gateway to becoming a thought leader in your field. Dive into the world of elite podcasting and master the art of influence and inspiration. And now, podcast personality, award-winning author and actress, Anne Scottlin.
Welcome back to Launch It, the Podcast Maestro. I'm Anne Scottlin. I'm so glad to have you here today, watching or listening. And we're going to talk about some things that often get overlooked when you are starting a podcast or when you're new in podcasting, depending on your background. Now, if you are a tech geek and a numbers person, this may come naturally to you. If you're not, then this might be news to you. And if you're somewhere in between, you're definitely going to go away with some answers today, because the question is, are analytics worth your time? For some podcasters, absolutely. For others, no. Which are you? That might surprise you, but we're going to talk about that. And also stay tuned until the end. I'm going to give you an exclusive tip on the most underrated podcast metric that could transform your growth strategy. So stay tuned for that. So first, we're going to get started with some of the pros and cons of different analytics tools, including my very favorite tool, which of course I will save for last. So stay tuned. You're going to enjoy this. We're going to have a good time, use some real life examples of successful podcasters. But first, I have a story for you. Do you ever get scared after the fact? It sounds funny, right? What you don't know can kill you, basically. So I'm a PADI certified scuba diver. But there was a time when I wanted to dive and I wasn't certified. So I had gone to Cozumel with some friends and I had never even trained on diving, but they were all certified and they were going on a big dive. And at first I was like, that just sounds scary. When I snorkel, my ears don't equalize. I think that it just probably would be extremely painful. Probably won't. Once I got there and realized how amazing the stuff was to see there on that reef in Cozumel, which drops like 1,000 feet into the trench, and you can actually swim down the edges of the reef and look at the cliff wall and see incredible sea life, colors, really clear water, gorgeous. I was like, I want to do some of that. I really want to do it. I found I wasn't going to be able to get PADI certified, but I was able to find someone who would train me to give me local permission, certification to do some diving. While everyone else went out on the boat for their real dive, I was on the beach with a guy who was going to train me how to scuba dive. Now, you should know, if you know anything about scuba diving, you know you always start in a pool. We didn't. We started on the beach, in the water. We went over everything once, and I went in, I practiced floating, and he said a bunch of stuff that I literally don't remember. And then eventually he's okay, let's go, let's dive. So I went down. It went really well. He was nearby, but I couldn't see him all the time. And I went down and I was checking my depth, and I got down to 80 feet, which is a lot for a first dive, way too much actually. And I was trying to figure out how to even out my weights, and all this was just all so new to me still. And I was just like, something isn't right. Now, remember, you're facing down at this point, right? And I was like, oh, I've got to figure this out. I stopped looking at my depth meter and I was trying to mess with my weights. And all of a sudden I felt this funny sensation on my back. It wasn't a shark, don't worry. I was at the surface again. I'd come up 80 feet in just a minute or two with no warning, not nearly enough supervision. And I couldn't believe I was at the surface. What I also didn't know yet was how dangerous that was. Because when you get certified, one of the things they teach you is how to use you guessed it this episode, the analytics on your dive computer. Because the dive computer, which looks like a big watch or sometimes a square screen, it tracks those crucial measurements like the depth, like the time, like your nitrogen levels in your tank, like your ascent rate, which I totally missed. It normally, once you learn how to use it, it helps you set your maximum depth and your bottom time, how much time you're going to spend down there based on how much you have in your tank. And it helps you keep track of your no decompression limits so you don't get decompression sickness, which is if you rise to the top too quickly, you can get, basically, to make it just sound terrible, bubbles in your blood. And if you fly, you could die. Okay, there. Was that good enough? For those of you who are PADI certified divers, I am still a casual diver, but I am certified now. And I learned how important the analytics were. I didn't know until later, and I did some dives and I managed fine. I had a better supervisor and I was with my friends who were all keeping track of me. So that was good, helping me out. But once I actually went back to get certified, I was absolutely freaked out by what I had done without the proper training. Without the proper metrics, I literally could have become very sick or died. So metrics can be very important. Analytics can be very important. As we've talked about, sometimes analytics are something you really need for your podcasting. And for some podcasters, they're not a big deal. And we want to figure out what are the differences. But first, let me tell you what they are and explain the terms in case you're not sure. Analytics in podcasting is basically counting your downloads or your listens, like most social media, right? Your subscribers, seeing how many people like, seeing how many people listen, tracking all that per episode as you go. And the question is, the data that you can get from tracking that, paying attention to your analytics, is it really critical to decision making? And it is interesting because for some people, and we've talked about this before, they're casual podcasters. They are, I'm just having fun, no matter if there's 1 people or 10 people or 100 people listening, I'm having fun. It's interesting. I believe in the subject matter, or I think it's entertaining. Maybe I'll hit it big. Let's just see. And they go for it. And that's absolutely fine. And they're not paying much attention to that. The analytics really aren't a priority for them. But those who really want to be a world-class podcaster are going to learn that some of these things are extremely important, and you really aren't making the cut unless you pay attention. So the key metrics you want to track are, first of all, downloads per episode. Now, this is interesting because when I say downloads, this is usually audio podcasting. But we also talk a lot about video podcasting here, and it can be both. There is some shifting going on around with that right now. So hang in there for more information. But statistics show that podcasts with over 5,000 downloads per episode, which sounds like a lot if you're brand new, but are in the top 10% globally. So if you want to be in the top 10% globally, if you want to have over 5,000 downloads per episode, you're probably going to find that it's very important for you to pay attention to your analytics. And how long are your listeners staying? This is another analytic that you really need to know. Podcasts with a 75% retention rate are more likely to attract high quality sponsors. So sometimes people forget about that. We're like, how do I monetize? How do I monetize? I'm like, a big part of that is getting your listeners to begin with. That's also important for understanding how podcasting works and how you need to have usually an upfront budget. But if you do make a splash in the right way, you can attract advertisers much more quickly. And if you're paying attention to the analytics, a lot of podcasters are like, I don't care. I don't need to advertise. I'm just getting the info out there. Again, probably people who analytics are not really that important to. And the other thing you really want, like with any marketing, is the geographic data. You really want to know who your listeners and viewers are and where they're located. Because even podcasts that are tailored to the largest geographic audience, so say you're particularly popular in the American Southeast or the American Northwest or a certain area in the UK or whatever place in the globe you are, you can help contour and customize your podcast, your guests, everything else to the region of the most viewers. And they say that you'll get about 20% more engagement when you do that because you already have a group of people understand where they are. A lot of times people don't even know who's listening. They see everyone as numbers, but they forget it actually matters where they are. So what are some podcasts that have done this really effectively? A good example, one we talked about last week, is Crime Junkie. Love it, with Ashley Flowers and Britt Pratt. They are those consummate true crime enthusiasts, right? Did I say enthusiasts? What language am I speaking? Enthusiasts. Anyway, so they took their listener data and decided to help create content that matched where their listeners were primarily located and other demographics. They saw a significant growth in their listener base because of that. They had earned a much higher following and higher listener retention rates, which we'll talk about again later. Super important. Another one, Armchair Expert with Dax Shepard. You know that one if you're like podcasts at all. It's probably very familiar to you, the actor and comedian Dax Shepard. His podcast features interviews with celebrities, experts, notable figures, and have a really good time. Became very popular. His downloads are huge. Right now, his downloads are over 20 million per month. How does he get that? There's lots of factors, but here's what he knows about his audience, his age demographic. Most of his listeners, again, this is majorities and averages, right? It's not who even you might think your target audience is or was. His average viewers and listeners, 25 to 44 years old, 60% female, 40% male, and they're mostly in the United States with significant listenership in other English-speaking countries like the UK and Canada. So he used his statistics to identify, and you don't worry, you don't have to have 20 million downloads to create statistics, not at all. But that's how he helped get 20 million downloads. So he really helped optimize his content based on this group of people, the age, the location, what were the most popular topics, what were the kinds of guests did they like the most? What kind of advertisers could he attract because he knows exactly who his audience is, that the majority of his audience are located in this place, that 60% say are female, what the age range is. Now you have statistics that really mean something to advertisers who want to be your sponsors. And then also just the audience engagement itself. If you realize that a bunch of your listeners, a portion of them are, say, in the UK, then you probably don't want to schedule your live shows when they're in bed. You probably want to schedule them when you can bridge both sides of the Atlantic, right? So this is very helpful information to know. I'm going to pause real quick. This episode is going fast as usual, so we're going to stop for a quick commercial. But when I come back, I'm going to share with you the tools you can use to get your analytics and what are some of the pros and cons of those tools. Which ones should you look for? Which ones should you check out? And which ones are a best fit for you? We'll be back in just a minute.
Picture this. You have worked your whole life to become an expert, a leader, a change maker, but you're so busy, most people will never discover you to recognize your work. Anne Scottlin, founder of Podcast Maestro, understands this challenge. With a decade of Hollywood experience and a proven track record as a business coach, Anne turns seasoned professionals into thought leaders through the art of podcasting. Podcast Maestro offers plug-and-play services, handling everything from pre-production to distribution, so you can focus on your message while Anne and her team manage the rest. Leverage Anne's Hollywood production knowledge, strategic business insight, and social media expertise to amplify your reach and impact. If you're ready to elevate your voice, connect with Anne Scottlin at Podcast Maestro and begin your podcast journey today.
Welcome back to Launch It, the Podcast Maestro with me, Anne Scottlin. Glad you stuck around because we are going to give you some really great information right now, the tools you need to create analytics if you find that important for your business plan. So we find that podcasts that utilize data-driven strategies grow 40% faster than those who don't. So this is a really good indicator of what might matter to you. If you want to be in that top 10%, if you want to be a world-class podcast, video or audio, you might want to pay attention to analytics. If you just want to have fun, we can talk more about that later. So what are some of these practical steps and what are the tools you can use? I have several here. I'm going to save my favorite one for last. First of all, real quick, PodTrack. This is a fairly universal tool. It tracks downloads, it tracks audience, demographics, unique listeners, which is very helpful. And it works with most of the major podcasting platforms, including Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts. So it handles most of the big boys. And primarily, it gives you industry benchmarks and comparative analysis. So it's really a good, solid tool. It hasn't been my go-to tool, but it is a good, solid tool, and it may depend on the size of your show and your budget. Then there's always Google Analytics. Pros and cons. Okay, what pros? It tracks your website traffic, your user behavior, conversion rates. If you've ever done anything with Google Ads or Google Analytics, you know how these things work. If not, you could read up on them. And the really good things is Google Analytics can be integrated with podcast websites, with landing pages, and embedded players. And one of the key features that it offers is deep insight into user behavior and traffic sources. So you get some of the most detailed results from Google Analytics when it's done right. There are some cons. It is very complicated to set up. The learning curve is very steep. And one of the things that I don't love about it is that it really depends on website traffic. It's dependent on website traffic. It focuses on measuring what listeners and viewers are going to your site or the website where you're being hosted. So if a significant portion of your audience is listening through podcast apps, for example, or platforms like Spotify or Apple Podcasts, then you're going to miss out on a lot of crucial data. And this is where I find a lot of podcast hosts and third-party hosts. There you go. Boy, that sounds crazy. Third-party hosts have a real weakness because they can't give you real data in real time. Often you have to wait for a month, and often it's incomplete. So just food for thought. Another good one, good solid one, is Chartable. Just like it sounds, it's charts everything. It's tracking your downloads, your demographics, your chart rankings. It also integrates with some of the platforms that you're going to be broadcasting on, which can be very helpful. Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, and I think several others as well. And one of its key features is Smart Links, and that's a tool that tracks listener actions from link click to podcast listen. So this is very important if you are into funnels, if that's part of your business. This can be very useful to you, and that's Chartable. And what else is important? And I'm going to list you three more tools here in one moment. But let's talk about how you track across these multiple platforms for just a second. So how can you use platform-specific analytics? So let's talk about YouTube analytics, Apple Podcast Connect. You can use those to gather your data. Again, if you are only on YouTube, you have it made already because you can use YouTube's analytics and possibly tie it into some of these other tools. You're good. But most podcasters that are really trying to create their reach and have a global influence are being broadcast on a multitude of platforms. And this is where it can get a little bit complicated. So Chartable is one of those. You can use their Smart Links, as I said, or Google Analytics if you really like that, to track your listener sources and their behavior. StreamYard, a really great tool, has its own analytics, but they're pretty basic. It's viewer count, it's engagement, it's source of views. And StreamYard is one of those broadcasting management tools where you can stream to more than one platform at a time. So for detailed insights on your analytics, you could integrate StreamYard with Google Analytics or other third-party tools. It does allow that. So this gives you an idea of how you can get at least some of your data. Some data is better than no data, but just realize that if it's limited, it is indeed, of course, incomplete. Another tool that one of my friends uses a lot is Libsyn. If you're listening, it's Libsyn, Libsyn. Again, pretty basic and does work with things like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and it does give really detailed reports. Again, it's just if it has the tools that you like. I highly recommend you get on YouTube or on the websites of these different tools, watch their demo, see where it fits in your tech comfort level. I think that's a really big thing for most people. Some of you podcasters out there, or I'm just talking too fast today. That's what happens when my mouth goes faster than my brain. Some of you podcasters out there are super tech savvy, and you're going to instantly know which one of these appeals most to you. But if you're not tech savvy, it doesn't mean you can't get your analytics. It just means surf the different tools and find one that fits you best, like your level. And I'm going to offer one that is a crowd pleaser here in a moment. Another one with good tools is Anchor, Anchor. It tracks the usual things, has some very good features, has some really easy to use interface and built-in analytics. Big con on this one for some of you, I'm not a huge fan because your files are stored on a third-party server. Your show and everything else is stored on their hard drives. And I really believe that, especially if you are broadcasting multiple places, you need to have your own show saved on your hard drive. If you're streaming live, obviously this is where it's more of an issue, but I would research that before I would consider Anchor, even though it is pretty user-friendly. Last, and my favorite, is the one that's the most fun to say, which is Buzzsprout. It's just user-friendly. It tracks listeners, locations, devices. Are they watching on a computer? Are they listening on their phone? Are they watching on a phone? The platforms, all the major ones that matter, Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, works with them. And it has a really comprehensive analytics dashboard. If you get on there or sign in or watch demos, you'll just find it very user-friendly and has really good listener stats. Find out how that might work for you. Again, some of these tools work only for audio, some work for video, some work for both, and you still, in the end, will probably have to compile from 2 to 3 sources total to get your accurate data. So create a spreadsheet. Use something like Buzzsprout, one of the other ones that appeals to you here. You're probably going to use the YouTube ones independently. If you're using something like StreamYard, you're probably also going to add theirs. At least you'll get a fairly decent overview of what you have. And if you hit it big, someone else can do it for you. So how do you set realistic goals for this? It really depends on what we've talked about in the past, which is literally, what is your intention? What is your mission? What is your business plan for your podcast? In fact, we should talk about that again soon because it's such an important element and so many people neglect to do it. They just have a podcast for fun and they don't realize that they can be going down a rabbit hole. Even if they're having fun, it's great. But also they probably won't be a world-class podcast and they probably won't be able to monetize very well if they are not paying attention to their analytics. So you want to experiment with different formats and see what works for you. So only you can decide if paying some attention to analytics, taking a little time to do that, is worth it for you. The world-class podcasts would say yes, almost universally, of course. I'll quote Pat Flynn here. He's the host of Smart Passive Income. Great podcast if you haven't listened. And he says, analytics are the heartbeat of our podcast strategy. By understanding our audience's preferences and behaviors, we're able to tailor our content, improve our engagement, and grow our listener base exponentially. It's like having a roadmap that guides us to success. And I could have just quoted that last sentence because it's so good. Paying attention to your analytics is like having a roadmap that guides you to success. So thank you for tuning in today on analytics. You're going to want to hang out and come back for the next episode because it's also going to be interesting. Oh, but first, I promised you my tip at the end of the most underrated podcast metric that could transform your growth strategy. It is this. Focus, once you're playing with your metrics, focus on the new versus returning listeners metric. That might surprise you. Why? Shouldn't only returning matter? No, because if you want to understand how well you're retaining your audience, you also want a healthy balance between new and returning listeners. In other words, if you hit your maximum, if all you have is repeat listeners, or are you still challenging and inviting to new listeners and new audiences who may still come in and you can appeal to? And maybe you can customize your formatting, your timing, your demographic appeal. You can tweak that a bit to continue to get new viewers or first-time viewers or one-time viewers that may eventually convert into longtime followers and fans. So that is my tip. Focus on the metric, new versus returning listeners, whenever you can get that, depending on what tool you are using. I hope, again, that you have had a little fun here with me talking about analytics. realizing that you should get PADI certified before you dive. And my challenge to you, if you're already podcasting this week, would be this: make one data-informed change to your podcast strategy. It's a good reminder. I will do it too. Make one data-informed change to your podcast strategy. It's just getting used to it and taking those baby steps. You'll soon realize it's much easier than it sounds. Next time, I'm going to talk about the art of interviewing. How do you get the best from your guest? If you are already a seasoned newscaster or speaker or interviewer, then you may not already have these tricks of the trade, but there's always more to learn. The art of interviewing, it really is an art, but I'm going to give you the clip notes of the art of interviewing so that you can get the best from your guests and keep your viewers and listeners engaged. So last of all, please subscribe. Send me your comments and questions. If you have any questions, please send them so I can answer them on the show. We stream here live Wednesdays at 9 a.m., 12 Eastern Standard. That's noon and 5 GMT. Thank you so much for spending a few minutes of your day with me, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.